It is inevitable that a case as infamous as that of the Jack the Ripper murders should, over the years, have become the subject of an awful lot of myth-making. Even at the time of the atrocities, all sorts of rumours that were circulating in the district about the victims and the murderer found their way into the daily newspapers, where many of them became accepted as fact. In time, these fallacies were picked up by authors who included them in books on the crimes, with the result that many of them have now become established tenets of Ripper law. A large number are still being trotted out today and are repeated over and over again in books, documentaries, films, as well as on web pages and social media posts, whilst several of the contributors to these outlets have added their own misconceptions to the field of Ripper studies. As Stephen Knight put it in his 1976 book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, it is a sombre reflection that, in the case of Jack the Ripper, several so-called serious historians have betrayed their responsibility and set down in print their own invented details and baseless speculation as definite fact. In this video, I will attempt to put aside invented details and baseless speculation and delve into the history of the Whitechapel murders to explode 10 common myths about Jack the Ripper. So, without further ado, let the myth-busting begin. Myth number 1. The murderer's name was Jack the Ripper. I can say, hand on heart and without any fear of contradiction, that the murderer's name was not Jack the Ripper. I can also say with certainty that Charles Lechmere, Aaron Kosminski, Montague John Druitt, Dr. Francis Tumblety, nor any of the hundreds of other suspects whose names have been put forward as the possible perpetrator of history's most notorious crime spree were not Jack the Ripper. One of them may have been the Whitechapel murderer, but the name Jack the Ripper is a fiction that first appeared towards the end of September 1888, when a letter purporting to have been written by the perpetrator of the crimes was sent to the office of the Central News Agency, which was located in this building on New Bridge Street in the City of London. Addressed to the boss, Central News Office, London City, the missive began, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet." It went on to boast in mocking terms about the killer's escapades thus far, and threatened that people would soon hear of him with his funny little games. But it was the letter's chilling signature that caught the public imagination, and it wasn't long before the perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders had become universally known as Jack the Ripper. Today, the line between the unknown miscreant who carried out the atrocities and the signature on the Dear Boss letter has become so blurred as to be virtually non-existent, and the killer is now almost always referred to as Jack the Ripper, despite the fact that the Whitechapel murderer and the author of the missive were almost certainly two different people. However, since the murderer is now invariably known under that sobriquet, I will adopt the appellation, and from this point on will refer to him as both the Whitechapel murderer and Jack the Ripper, even though that wasn't his or her actual name. Myth number 2. Jack the Ripper was the world's first serial killer. It is often stated that Jack the Ripper was history's first serial killer. There is even a 2006 documentary titled Jack the Ripper, the First Serial Killer. However, he was unequivocally not the first serial killer. Firstly, the term serial killer is a 20th century invention that wasn't in use at the time of the Ripper murders. He was viewed then as a repeat killer, and there had been many of those before him. Examples include Burke and Hare, who in the 1820s had been responsible for the murders of 16 victims in Edinburgh. John Bishop and his gang of London body snatchers turned murderers, whose most notorious killing was that of the so-called Italian boy in 1831. William Palmer, the Rugeley poisoner, who was hanged in 1856 for the murder of his friend John Cook, but who was also suspected of having murdered his brother, mother-in-law, and 4 of his children, and who was, according to Charles Dickens, the greatest villain that ever stood in the Old Bailey. Mary Ann Cotton, hanged in 1873 for poisoning her stepson, but who is also thought to have murdered 11 of her children and 3 of her husbands. All of these, and many others besides, preceded Jack the Ripper's reign of terror, and several of them had many more victims than he did. Of course, the difference between these murderers and Jack the Ripper is that they were caught and paid the penalty for their crimes, whereas the Whitechapel murderer was never brought to justice. His identity is shrouded in mystery and remains the source of endless speculation to this day. His crimes also caught the public imagination in a way that those of previous repeat murderers hadn't, and the newspapers responded to the public demand by devoting an enormous amount of coverage to his atrocities, thus turning a series of sordid crimes in a small part of London into an international phenomenon. It could be argued that Jack the Ripper was the first media murderer, but he was most certainly not the world's first serial killer. Myth number 3. Jack the Ripper had 5 victims. So well established is the idea of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper that the figure is now rarely questioned. However, the truth is that nobody knows for certain how many victims Jack the Ripper did have. How could they? Since we don't actually know who Jack the Ripper was, it is impossible to give a definitive answer as to the exact number of his victims. It should be remembered that the police dossier on the Whitechapel murders contains the names of 11 victims, beginning with Emma Smith, who was murdered in April 1888, and ending with Francis Coles, murdered in February 1891. Today, it is impossible to say with certainty how many of those 11 were murdered by the same person. There may also have been other victims, such as the Thames Torso murders, and several similar crimes carried out in different parts of the world in the years after his London reign of terror had ended. Even those close to the investigation at the time couldn't agree on which victims were murdered by the same killer. It is sometimes stated that one of the first people to express belief in the murderers having 5 victims was A Division's police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond. This isn't, strictly speaking, true. In fact, Bond believed there were 6 victims. It is true that in a report compiled at the request of Dr. Robert Anderson, the head of the Metropolitan Police's Criminal Investigation Department, which was submitted on the 10th of November 1888, Bond wrote that he had read the notes on the murders of Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and had carried out a post-mortem examination on the body of Mary Kelly, and that, in his opinion, all 5 murders were no doubt committed by the same hand. However, following the murder of Alice Mackenzie on the 17th of July 1889, Bond examined her body, again at the request of Robert Anderson, and reported that, "I am of opinion that the murder was performed by the same person who committed the former series of Whitechapel murders." So Bond evidently believed that there were 6 victims, not 5. The main exponent of the idea of the canonical 5 was Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten, who in his 1894 report, now known as the Macnaghten Memorandum, wrote, "The Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only." He then went on to list the names of those who are now referred to as the canonical 5 victims. In the same report, Macnaghten also stated that the murderer's brain gave way altogether after his awful glut in Miller's Court, and he immediately committed suicide, or as a possible alternative, was found to be so hopelessly mad by his relations that he was, by them, confined in some asylum. In his autobiography, Days of My Years, published in 1914, Macnaghten was emphatic that the Whitechapel murderer committed 5 murders and, to give the devil his due, no more. Of course, if Macnaghten was correct and the killer had either committed suicide or been placed in an asylum by his relatives after the murder of Mary Kelly, then the later Whitechapel murders victims cannot have died at his hand. However, it is worth pointing out that Macnaghten wasn't actually in the Metropolitan Police at the time of the canonical 5 murders. He only joined in June 1889 as Assistant Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Department. That's not to say that he wasn't in a position to have an in-depth knowledge of the case. On the contrary, he would later become the Chief Constable, and by the time of his retirement in 1913, he had risen to the post of Assistant Commissioner. So he would certainly have had access to or knowledge of the lines of enquiry that were being pursued at the time of the atrocities, and of course the investigations into the crimes continued for several years, and he certainly took an active role in the investigations after he joined the Metropolitan Police. But his certainty as to there having been 5 victims, and 5 victims only, was not shared by some of his colleagues, several of whom considered Martha Tabram, murdered on the 7th of August 1888, the first victim of Jack the Ripper. This view is shared by a large number of modern researchers and historians. There is also dissent today over how many of the other victims actually died at the same hand. Some ripperologists dismiss Elizabeth Stride and Mary Kelly as having been victims of the same killer as Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, whilst others promote the idea that all the Whitechapel atrocities, as well as the Thames Torso murders, were carried out by Jack the Ripper. There is also a body of opinion that suggests that none of the murders were related and were in fact the work of different perpetrators. With so much debate and disagreement, it is impossible to say how many victims Jack the Ripper had, and the certainty that he had 5 victims and 5 victims only is by no means an ascertained and concrete fact. Myth number 4. Jack the Ripper wore a top hat. One of the most iconic images of Jack the Ripper, or the Whitechapel murderer, is that of a swarthy figure in a top hat and swirling cape stalking his victims through the gaslit alleyways of old London town. So entrenched is this guise that I'm sure if I asked you to close your eyes and conjure up a mental picture of Jack the Ripper, this is the portrayal that would come most readily to mind. The top hat, also known as a high hat, a cylinder hat, or, more informally, a topper, had been around since the 18th century and was viewed as an essential part of a gentleman's wardrobe. The less well-off with social pretensions also liked to wear one, although theirs would often be a cast-off that had been acquired from one of the many second-hand clothes shops that thrived in the poorer quarters of the Victoria metropolis. The top hat was also the favoured headgear of doctors, although as a correspondent to the medical journal The Lancet pointed out in early October 1888, there was a belief that doctors really should have considered a more practical, hygienic and comfortable form of headgear. Would it not be a great boon to medical men to abolish the use of the tall silk hat known as the top hat? Has it not every disadvantage as a comfortable and hygienic headgear? The tall hat, now worn, constricts the head, makes many people's head ache, impedes circulation in the scalp, and is always a nuisance in wet weather. Several of the newspaper illustrations of the period that depicted doctors attending the crime scenes portrayed them either wearing a top hat or else showed their topper on the ground alongside them as they examined the body of the deceased. However, following the murder of Annie Chapman, a debate began as to whether or not the murderer possessed medical knowledge. At the inquest into Annie's death, the divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, testified that in his opinion the instrument used at the throat and abdomen must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade, and could have been such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes. He also stated that there were indications of anatomical knowledge on the part of the murderer. In his summing up at the inquest, the coroner, Edwin Baxter, was emphatic that Annie Chapman's injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. The killer had removed and gone off with her uterus, he said, and the fact that there were no meaningless cuts demonstrated that whoever had removed it knew where to find it, what difficulties he would have to contend against, and how he should use the knife so as to abstract the organ without damage to it. No unskilled person could have known where to find it or have recognized it when it was found, he opined. It must have been done by one accustomed to the dissecting room. Although Baxter didn't pursue his line that the killer had demonstrated anatomical knowledge at the inquests into the deaths of the later victims, nor for that matter did the other coroners who presided over the inquests into the deaths of Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly, both his and Dr. Phillips's statements received extensive press coverage throughout late September and early October, and the suspicion that the murderer might be a doctor started to take hold, and since doctors wore top hats, the image of a top-hatted perpetrator began to evolve. However, the Whitechapel murderer almost certainly didn't wear one. Well, actually, that might not be quite correct. He may have worn one. Since we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, we can't say with any degree of certainty whether or not he wore a top hat at some stage in his life. So let's just say he didn't wear one on the nights of the murders. Witnesses who may have seen the victims with their murderer shortly before their deaths described a variety of headgear. Mrs. Elizabeth Long, who saw Annie Chapman chatting with a man on the pavement outside 29 Hanbury Street shortly before Annie's body was found in the backyard of that building, said that the man she saw was wearing a brown deerstalker hat. Israel Schwartz, who saw Elizabeth Stride being attacked by a man outside the entrance to Dutfield's yard 15 minutes before her body was found in the yard, stated that the man he saw was wearing a black cap with a peak. Joseph Lavender, who witnessed a man talking with Catherine Eddowes outside the entrance to Mitre Square in the early hours of Sunday the 30th of September, shortly before her body was found in the square's southwest corner, described the man he saw as wearing a cloth cap with a peak. George Hutchinson, who may have seen Mary Kelly with her murderer in the early hours of the 9th of November, claimed that the man he saw was wearing a dark felt hat turned down in the middle. And the list of possible witnesses and styles of headgear goes on, none of them mentioning or featuring a top hat. Of course, we cannot say with any degree of certainty that the men who the witnesses saw with the various victims went on to murder them, but what is worthy of note is that none of the witnesses' descriptions mentioned that the man they saw was wearing a top hat. The illustrated representations of the murderer that were published in the newspapers throughout September, October, and early November show him in a variety of hats and caps, most of which were based, admittedly in some cases very loosely, on witness descriptions. But by mid-November, the image of a top-hatted perpetrator had begun to settle, and when in the aftermath of Mary Kelly's murder on the 9th of November, several witnesses spoke to journalists to tell them of encounters with a suspicious-looking top-hatted man in the neighbourhood, that image was cemented, and the murderer began to be depicted wearing one. This illustration, for example, appeared in the Penny Illustrated newspaper on Saturday the 17th of November, and is more or less the image we have of him today. With the coming of the movies, the top hat became a trope that was used, especially in silent films, to depict a villain, and as far as Jack the Ripper is concerned, that trope has since been used in almost every film, television drama, documentary, book, and magazine article about the murders, and the moment that figure appears, you instantly associate it with the perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders, and people would probably feel short-changed if he wasn't wearing a top hat. Even some authors who really should know better have been known to use the trope on the covers of their books. So Jack the Ripper's top hat, despite being a complete myth, will remain a part of his apparel for as long as interest in the case continues. Myth number 5. Jack the Ripper carried a black bag. The other item of apparel that Jack the film star is seldom without is a black bag, and of course this was something that doctors carried with them, thus supplementing the impression of the top-hatted perpetrator. It has to be said that none of the witnesses who may have seen the killer with his victims mentioned that the person they had seen had been carrying a black bag. George Hutchinson, who saw Mary Kelly with a man on Commercial Street on the morning of her murder, came closest when he said that the man he saw was carrying a small parcel in his left hand with a kind of strap round it. There was also a lady by the name of Mrs. Pormier who claimed that she had been approached by a suspicious-looking man on the morning of Mary Kelly's murder at the junction of Wygate Street and Sandys Row, about 2 minutes' walk from Dorset Street where the murder had taken place. Mrs. Pormier said that the man was wearing a black silk hat, a black coat, and was carrying a black shiny bag about 1 foot in depth and 1.5 feet in length. Sarah Roney claimed that she had been approached by the same man in Brushfield Street on the night before Mary Kelly's murder. He asked her if she would go with him. She told him that she would not and asked him what he had in the bag. "Something the ladies don't like," was his reply. These stories were reported extensively in the newspapers and were no doubt widely circulated in the neighbourhood, with the result that the idea that the killer carried a black bag, which had been doing the rounds since early October, took hold, and we have several records of men innocently making their way through the streets of the East End carrying black bags, being set upon and almost lynched by the terror-stricken mobs of the district. But how had the rumour that the killer carried one begun? In the early hours of the 30th of September, Leon Goldstein, having enjoyed a coffee in a coffee shop in Spectacle Alley, headed home to 22 Christian Street. He was carrying a black bag that was, he later stated, half filled with empty cigarette boxes. Hurrying along Burner Street, he passed a lady who was standing outside her house. Goldstein barely paid her any attention as he raced past, being more intent on getting home rather than observing any of the early morning folk he encountered on his homeward dash. Unbeknownst to Goldstein, however, the lady, Mrs. Fanny Mortimer, had most certainly noticed him. She lived at number 36 Burner Street, 4 doors up from Dutfield Yard, where the body of Elizabeth Stride would be found at 1 a.m. that morning. She had, she said, stood outside her house at some stage between 12:30 a.m. and 1 a.m. and had then gone indoors. She was getting ready for bed when she heard a great commotion in the street. Hurrying outside, she was told that there had been another dreadful murder. When interviewed by the police in the aftermath of the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body, Mrs. Mortimer said that she had neither seen or been aware of anyone entering the gates of Dutfield Yard during her time outside. The only man she had seen, she said, was a young man who was carrying a black shiny bag. According to the Daily News, the man had walked very fast down the street from the direction of Commercial Road. Reading the accounts of the suspicious young man with the shiny black bag in the papers a few days later, Leon Goldstein must have felt the blood drain from his face when he realized that the police were now looking for him as a potential suspect in the recent murders. He promptly headed round to Leman Street Police Station, where he handed himself in. The police quickly exonerated him of any involvement in the crimes, and they wasted no time in relaying the information that the mysterious stranger seen by Fanny Mortimer had been identified and had been ruled out as a suspect. But the newspapers were less efficient at notifying their readers that the man with the black bag was not a person of interest to the police, Consequently, Goldstein's self-identification and subsequent exoneration received very little press coverage, with the result that the idea of the killer possessing a shiny black bag became fixed in the public mind and has since become another established part of the Ripper's attire. As for the killer actually carrying a black bag, well, once again, there is no evidence that he ever did. Myth number 6. Jack the Ripper carried out his murders in the fog. In many of the movies and TV dramas that feature the story of the Jack the Ripper murders, the crimes are shown as taking place in thick London fog. In truth, there was no fog on any of the nights of the murders. That's not to say that fog wasn't a fixture of the Victorian metropolis. On the contrary, it was so frequent as to be almost a part of the very fabric of 19th century London. The summer of 1888 had been a very wet one, and in July it even snowed in several parts of the country. The night of the 6th to the 7th of August, over which the murder of Martha Tabram took place, was cold, and it rained throughout the evening, but there was no fog. On the night of the 30th to the 31st of August that saw the murder of Mary Nichols, there were thunderstorms and sharp showers, but again, no fog. The 7th to the 8th of September, when Annie Chapman was murdered, was unsettled and showery, but fog was conspicuous by its absence. Over the weekend of the 29th and 30th of September, according to the Western Morning News in its edition of Monday, October the 1st, the weather was fine, but so cold that in many houses the winter fires were started. It had rained on the Saturday night, although this had cleared up by the early hours of Sunday the 30th. This was the morning on which the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes took place, so it was wet, cold, but emphatically not foggy. The 9th of November, the date on which Mary Kelly was murdered, was the day of the Lord Mayor's procession in the City of London. The Eastern Post looked back on the pageant in its next day's edition. Lord Mayor Whitehead was not fortunate in the matter of the weather on his inauguration day. During the night, heavy rain fell, and yesterday morning dawned with a damp, drizzly atmosphere, the air being raw and cold, and a sharp northeast wind blowing. The attendance of the public in the streets, therefore, to view the procession was small in comparison with previous years. So the night over which Mary Kelly's murder had taken place was cold and wet, but fog was once again an elusive participant in the murder. And yet the imagery of the murders having taken place in thick London fog is irresistible, and in almost every film or television drama that has been made about the Jack the Ripper atrocities, as the camera begins to roll, the fog machines have been cranked up to pump the luminous clouds of swirling, menacing fog onto the set where a top-hatted figure is removing his sharp knife from a black bag in order to murder yet another unfortunate and unsuspecting actress. So the myth of the fog will continue to swirl around the Whitechapel murders for as long as TV and film executives are willing to commission celluloid or digital retellings of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Myth number 7. Jack the Ripper travelled in a carriage. Several of the films that feature the atrocities have shown the murderer travelling around the East End in a horse-drawn carriage, sometimes luring a victim into the coach, inside which the murder is committed and the body then dumped at the site at which it will be found, or else leaving the coach to carry out the foul deed before clambering back into the conveyance to be driven away from the scene by a complicit coachman. In reality, Jack the Ripper almost certainly travelled on foot. The majority of the murders took place in the early hours of the morning in deserted, out-of-the-way places. A coach roaming the narrow back streets of Whitechapel at such an ungodly hour would almost certainly have attracted attention and would have been noted and remembered by any locals who saw or heard it, not to mention by the police constables whose beats took them through those thoroughfares. A solitary killer, moving about on foot, could duck into doorways or dart down alleyways to avoid being spotted. Hiding a horse and carriage from prying eyes, on the other hand, would have proved somewhat problematic. In the case of Mary Nichols, there were initial suggestions that, given the relatively small amount of blood found at the spot where her body was discovered in Bucks Row, she may have been murdered in a house nearby and, according to the Daily News, her clothes then being huddled on the body, which was afterwards conveyed out to be deposited in the street. However, it was quickly established that her murder had taken place at the site where her body was found. Thereafter, it was more than apparent that the other murders also took place at the locations where the bodies were discovered. No witnesses ever reported hearing the clatter of horses' hooves echoing through the night, nor did anyone ever mention seeing or hearing something as conspicuous as a coach and horses in Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Berners Street, Mitre Square, or Dorset Street. So, as dramatic as it is to picture an aristocratic villain being driven around the deserted streets of the East End in search of poverty-stricken victims, the reality is that Jack the Ripper did not travel by carriage. Myth number 8. The victims knew each other. The majority of the films and dramas that portray the murders as some sort of conspiracy, either official, royal, Masonic, or all three, suggest that the victims knew each other and that the crimes were carried out to silence them because they were blackmailing either the government or the royal family. However, there is no actual evidence to suggest that the victims did know each other. It is true that they all resided in a relatively small part of Whitechapel at the times of their deaths, but this enclave, which was known as the Wicked or Evil Quarter Mile, and which consisted of thoroughfares such as George Street, Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, Fashion Street, White's Row and Dorset Street, was awash with common lodging houses, and these were home to a transient community that numbered thousands of people. In a letter to the Daily Telegraph on the 21st of September 1888, a correspondent who signed himself a ratepayer highlighted just how many people did make use of the common lodging houses in the relatively small area between Baker's Row and Middlesex Street. There are no less than 146 registered lodging houses with a number of beds exceeding 6,000. Of these, 1,150 are in Flower and Dean Street alone, and nearly 700 in Dorset Street. Some of the houses contain as few as 4 beds, whilst others have as many as 350. So the number of people crammed into the area in which the victims resided was vast. So is there any evidence that the victims did know each other? In the aftermath of Mary Kelly's murder, an article appeared in the Echo which began by making it clear that the police were refusing to share any information about this latest atrocity with the press, as they were anxious to preserve any clues they may have had. Desperate for a story, the Echo's representative had spoken with the locals to glean information, and many of those he spoke to evidently knew as little as he did, but were unwilling to admit it, with the result that his subsequent article contained quite a few inaccuracies that were based on local gossip and barroom speculation. For example, the article reported that the murder had taken place in the second-floor front room or in the passage leading to it, that the victim was lying on the floor, and that her head had been absolutely severed from the body. It then went on to quote a friend of the murdered woman who had supposedly known her for some considerable time. The victim was, the woman said, on fairly good terms with the other people in the street and her fellow unfortunates in Dorset Street, who number, I should say, about 50. The reporter then provided a little biography on the victim. She was, it is hardly necessary to say, extremely poor. She belonged, morally and in every other respect, to the class to which Annie Chapman belonged. Singular to relate, the murdered woman, Annie Chapman, was a friend of this very Mary Jane Kelly. However, since the article then went on to make the claim that the murdered woman had a little boy aged 6 or 7 living with her, and that the child had been sent out to buy sweets by the murderer when he returned to the room with the boy's mother, the reliability of the informant or informants is called into question, and the information provided needs to be taken with an extremely large pinch of salt. As for Annie Chapman and Mary Kelly being friends, the honest truth is we can't say for certain whether they were or not. Annie Chapman had been residing at Crossingham's common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, a little to the west of Miller's Court, where Mary Kelly would later be murdered, and she had been evicted from the premises in the early hours of the morning of her murder, as she didn't have the money to pay for her bed. It is a possibility, maybe even a certainty, that she and Mary Kelly would have passed each other in Dorset Street on a regular, if not daily basis, and there can be no doubt that Mary Kelly would have known of Annie Chapman's murder. However, there is no evidence that they were even acquaintances, let alone friends. Indeed, the known facts suggest the contrary. At the inquest into Mary Kelly's death, her lover, Joseph Barnett, told the coroner that he had bought newspapers and read to her everything about the murders which she asked me about. Had she been a friend of one or any of the previous victims, Barnett would surely have mentioned it, and the fact that he didn't suggests that she and Annie Chapman didn't know each other. Dorset Street, although a relatively short thoroughfare, about 130 yards long, was home to a profusion of common lodging houses. In the aftermath of Mary Kelly's murder, it was reported that in one house alone there are 260 persons, and several houses accommodate over 200. Crossingham's, at which Annie Chapman had been residing up to her death, accommodated around 114 people. So for a relatively short street, Dorset Street was vastly overcrowded, and it certainly wasn't the neighbourly enclave that it is often portrayed as having been in films and television dramas. As for the other victims, although they also resided at the common lodging houses of the Wicked Quarter Mile, there was never any suggestion of any of them being friends with each other. Mary Nichols, as far as can be ascertained, had only arrived in the East End in early August 1888, and she had resided at 2 lodging houses, Wilmot's at 18 Thrall Street and the White House at 56 Flower and Dean Street. Michael Kidney, Elizabeth Stride's lover, gave his address as 38 Dorset Street at the inquest into her death, and testified that Liz had been living with him on and off for around 3 years, albeit he didn't elaborate on the addresses at which they had lived during that time. We know that on the day of her murder, Liz Stride was staying at a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street, and that, according to the deputy lodging house keeper, Elizabeth Tanner, she had lodged there, when not living with Michael Kidney, on and off for about 6 years. For the 7 years prior to her death, Catherine Eddowes had been living with John Kelly, a jobbing market porter, and much of their time was spent at a common lodging house located at 55 Flower and Dean Street. We know from various inquest testimonies who their friends and acquaintances were, and at no time were any of the victims numbered amongst each other's circle of associates. Another factor that has been put forward in favour of the victims knowing each other is that they all drank in the same pubs. The 10 Bells on Commercial Street is the one that is often portrayed as their local, with the Britannia at the junction of Dorset Street and Commercial Street also being given as another common watering hole. The honest truth is we don't actually know which pubs the victims regularly drank in, only which ones they were drinking in the hours leading up to their deaths. Mary Nichols had been drinking in the Frying Pan at the junction of Brick Lane and Thrall Street. We don't know which pub or pubs Annie Chapman had visited on the night prior to her murder, although we do know that she did frequent the Britannia. There were also unconfirmed reports that she had been seen in the 10 Bells at 5 a.m. on the morning of her murder. Liz Stride had begun the evening prior to her death drinking in the Queen's Head at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street, and she was later seen outside the Bricklayers Arms on Settle Street. We don't know where Catherine Eddowes had been drinking on the day prior to her murder, only that she was arrested for being drunk on Aldgate High Street on the evening of the 29th of September. Finally, Mary Kelly had been drinking in the Horn of Plenty on Dorset Street, as well as in the Britannia and the 10 Bells. It is possible that all the victims at one time or another had drunk in one, several, or all of these pubs, but drinking in the same busy hostelries doesn't prove that they actually knew each other. The final proof that is often given for the victims knowing each other is the fact that they were all prostitutes and so must have been professionally acquainted. Putting aside the argument as to whether or not the victims actually were prostitutes, a large number of women in the Wicked Quarter Mile appear to have been casual streetwalkers. Indeed, in mid-October, the Home Office asked the police to provide information on prostitution in the Wicked Quarter Mile. Based on the observations of H Division constables whose beats took in the district to the east and west of Commercial Street, the police replied that "We have no means of ascertaining what women are prostitutes and who are not, but there is an impression that there are about 1,200 prostitutes of a very low condition." Even if this number was exaggerated, and it probably was, the sheer number of casual sex workers that walked the streets of Whitechapel would reduce the chances of the 5 victims being acquainted with one another considerably. There is a possibility that they may have been on nodding terms with one another, but no evidence ever emerged that any professional relationships between them went beyond that. So it is true that the victims lodged in the relatively small enclave around the southern reach of Commercial Street, but since the streets in which they resided were known for a proliferation of common lodging houses and thousands of lodgers passed through these places night after night, there really is no reason to suppose that the victims of Jack the Ripper actually knew each other. Myth number 9. Annie Chapman's rings and coins were arranged at her feet. An oft-repeated piece of misinformation about the murder of Annie Chapman is that her killer arranged her rings, coins and other possessions around her feet in a manner that suggested that a murderer was taking part in some sort of elaborate ritual. Whereas such an image can add a dramatic twist to a drama or movie, historically this simply did not happen, albeit the idea that it had happened dates back to the very day of the murder. When Annie Chapman's body was discovered in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street by John Davis at 6 a.m. on the 8th of September, he immediately summoned several men from the street outside to view the scene. They all then headed off to find a police officer, and it wasn't long before Inspector Joseph Chandler was making his way through the narrow passage of number 29. There was nobody in the yard when he got there, and upon the arrival of several constables, Chandler cleared people from the passage and ensured that nobody went near the body until the arrival of the Divisional Police Surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips. When Dr. Phillips arrived at 6:30 a.m., he pronounced life extinct and then examined the body. He told the inquest into Annie Chapman's death that, "I searched the yard and found a small piece of coarse muslin, a small tooth comb and a pocket comb in a paper case lying at the feet of the woman near the paling, and they had apparently been arranged there in order. I delivered these things into the keeping of the police." Phillips also noted that there was an abrasion over the ring finger with distinct markings of a ring or rings. Chandler told the inquest that, after the body had been removed, a piece of coarse muslin and a small hair comb were found. So the initial responder and the attending doctor both noted several of the woman's personal effects, which incidentally had come from a pocket under her skirt that had been torn in the attack, were found on the ground by the body. Rings had also been torn from her fingers and had apparently been taken away by her killer. During his summing up at the inquest, the coroner, Wynne Edwin Baxter, would draw the jury's attention to the way in which the contents of her pockets had been arranged. All was done with cool impudence and reckless daring, but perhaps nothing is more noticeable than the emptying of her pockets and the arrangement of their contents with businesslike precision in order near her feet. On the 19th of September, Inspector Aberline compiled a 15-page report on the murders of Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman. With regard to Annie Chapman's rings, he wrote, "The deceased was in the habit of wearing 2 brass rings, a wedding and a keeper. These were missing when the body was found, and the finger bore marks of their having been removed by force. Special inquiries have been made at all places where they may have been offered for pledge or for sale by a person believing them to be gold, but nothing has resulted therefrom." In a report dated the 19th of October, Chief Inspector Swanson stated that a special inquiry to find rings was also made at all pawnbrokers, jewellers, dealers. Timothy Donovan, the deputy lodging house keeper at Crossingham's lodging house, from which Annie had been ejected on the morning of her murder, was quoted in the Times on Wednesday the 12th of September as having told a representative from a press agency that on the previous morning 2 police constables had visited him and showed him 2 rings, one a half-worn-out engaged ring, the other appearing to be a wedding ring, which they stated had been discovered at a pawnbroker's. Donovan did not think they were the rings he had seen Mrs. Chapman wearing. So the rings had evidently been taken away by her murderer, and the police were so convinced that the killer had mistakenly thought them of value that they had conducted inquiries at any place he might try to sell or pledge them. They were therefore most certainly not arranged in a ritualistic pattern at her feet. Nor, according to Phillips and Chandler, were any coins found by or near the body. So where did the idea of their presence come from? The Evening Standard on Monday the 10th of September carried the following article. Soon after the murder was reported, a woman told the police that a man who spoke to her in the streets of Spitalfields at an early hour that morning gave her 2 half-sovereigns, but she refused to do what he wished. Thereupon he commenced to knock her about. She screamed and ran off. She afterwards discovered that what he said were half-sovereigns were brass medals. This story appears to have been circulating in the district over the weekend of the murder, and on Sunday the 9th of September, Lloyd's Weekly News was one of the first papers to link it with the murder of Annie Chapman. In the dress of the dead woman, 2 farthings were found, so brightly polished as to lead to the belief that they were intended to be passed off as half-sovereigns, and it is probable that they were given to her by the murderer as an inducement for her to accompany him. Over the course of that week, other newspapers carried reports that 2 polished farthings had been found on the dead woman. On Tuesday, the 11th of September, the Daily News tried to disabuse its readers of the notion that any coins had been found at the scene of Annie Chapman's murder. The police attach importance to finding the man who gave the woman, Emily Walton, 2 brass medals or bright farthings as half-sovereigns when in a yard of one of the houses in Hanbury Street at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, and who then began to ill-use the woman. But it is not true that 2 farthings were found in the dress pocket of the murdered woman. However, even some police officers appear to have been convinced that coins were found at the scene. Inspector Edmund Reed, in his testimony at the inquest into the death of Alice Mackenzie, who was murdered on the 17th of July 1889, referred to a blood-stained farthing being found under Alice's body, and in response to a question from a member of the jury, stated that, in one of the previous murder cases, there were 2 farthings found. It is not clear where Reed got this information from, since official police reports and inquest testimonies from those who had been present at the scene make it clear that no coins were found at the scene of Annie Chapman's murder. But the idea of the coins and rings took hold, and soon their presence was being stated as fact. Many years later, Leonard Matters, in his book The Mystery of Jack the Ripper, the World's Greatest Crime Problem, published in 1929, wrote about the murder of Annie Chapman that another interesting fact in this case was that 2 brass rings which the woman wore were taken from her fingers, and the trumpery contents of her dress pocket, 2 or 3 coppers and odds and ends, were carefully laid out at the feet. William Stewart, in his book Jack the Ripper, A New Theory, published in March 1939, featured a chapter in which he reproduced what he stated was an account of the discovery of the body of Annie Chapman as told to the author by the late Oswald Allen, sometime journalist on the staff of the Pall Mall Gazette. According to Allen, he was the first journalist to arrive at 29 Hanbury Street, and having visited the scene of the murder, he hurried back to the offices of the Gazette and rushed out his report for editing. In that report, he claimed to have written, "A curious feature of this crime is the murderer had pulled off some brass rings which the victim had been wearing, and these, together with some trumpery articles which had been taken from her pockets, were placed carefully at the victim's feet." This article is often quoted as having been published in the Pall Mall Gazette on the very day of Annie Chapman's murder, although I have been unable to find any trace of it in the Pall Mall Gazette of the 8th of September, and observant viewers might notice that the quote bears uncanny similarities to what Leonard Matters had written in his book 10 years earlier. However, the idea that her rings and coins had been carefully arranged at Annie Chapman's feet had been stated as fact in 2 books on the Jack the Ripper crimes, and had soon become an established fact. In 1976, Stephen Knight published Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, a book that caused a sensation with its claim that the murders were carried out by prominent Freemason Sir William Gull to hide a royal scandal involving Prince Albert Edward Victor, and were the culmination of a full-scale cover-up organised at the highest level of government. In a chapter titled The Masonic Killers, Knight turned to the murder of Annie Chapman and wrote that the act of placing brass rings and other items was Masonic, an act of twisted symbolism. Brass is the sacred metal of the Masons because Hiram Abiff was a worker in brass. He supervised the moulding of the 2 great hollow brass pillars which stood at the entrance to Solomon's Temple and which have become the symbol of Freemasonry. 2 brass rings side by side look exactly like 2 hollow brass pillars in cross-section. Knight, however, did acknowledge that the rings were missing, although he accused Dr. George Bagster Phillips of removing them from the scene shortly after Annie's body was found in order to eliminate the clue of the brass rings, and Coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter, according to Knight, was then told they had been stolen by the killer. The idea that Annie Chapman's rings and coins were arranged ritualistically at her feet is now often presented as historical fact, whereas the truth is the rings were missing and the coins weren't present at the scene. Myth number 10. Sir Charles Warren resigned because the police couldn't catch Jack the Ripper. In his memoirs, Days of My Years, Melville Macnaghten claimed that Jack the Ripper committed suicide on or about the 10th of November 1888 after he had knocked out a commissioner of police. He was referring to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, who did indeed resign on the 8th of November, the day before Mary Kelly's murder. Leonard Matters, in The Mystery of Jack the Ripper, described the police waiting outside Mary Kelly's room, awaiting the arrival of the bloodhounds that Sir Charles Warren had ordered were to be put on the murderer's scent in the event of another killing. "The hounds did not come," he wrote. Something had happened at Scotland Yard, and even the local inspectors were not aware of it. Sir Charles Warren had resigned as Commissioner of Police only the night before. It was never admitted, of course, that his resignation was due to his inability to lay the murderer by the heels, but for no other possible reason could the circumstances have arisen which compelled his resignation. Well, actually, there was a compelling reason for Warren's resignation, and he was not knocked out because his men couldn't lay Jack the Ripper by the heels. In fact, it was a far more mundane piece of official protocol that did for Sir Charles Warren. Throughout 1887 and 1888, the Metropolitan Police had come in for an absolute barrage of press criticism, some justified, much of it not. Although this had been going on since long before the Jack the Ripper murders began, it intensified throughout September and October 1888. Sir Charles Warren decided to respond to the attacks, and in the November issue of Murray's magazine he published an article, "The Police of the Metropolis," in which he defended his force. Unfortunately, he failed to get Home Office approval for the piece, and the Home Secretary, Sir Henry Matthews, with whom Warren had, to put it mildly, a difficult working relationship, instructed a departmental clerk to send a letter of rebuke to the police commissioner. The letter was accompanied by a copy of a Home Office circular from 1879, which specified that no officer, including the Commissioner, was to publish any work relating to the department without first obtaining the approval of the Home Secretary. The instruction, so Warren was curtly informed, was to be strictly complied with in future. On the 8th of November, Warren responded that if he had known of the existence of such a rule, he would never have accepted the position of Metropolitan Police Commissioner. He pointed out that the essence of the circular was that anyone would be able to make anonymous attacks on the police, and the Commissioner would be unable to correct or challenge any untrue or inaccurate allegations. Arguing that the Home Secretary did not have the power to give orders to the police force, Warren refused to abide by the instruction and tendered his resignation. 2 days later, Matthews wrote back accepting Warren's resignation. In the interim, between Warren tendering his resignation and Matthews accepting it, Jack the Ripper struck again and murdered Mary Kelly on the 9th of November. As a result, the rumour circulated that Warren's resignation had come about because of his force's inability to bring the killer to justice. However, when Matthews announced the resignation in the House of Commons, he was very specific that the failure of the police to discover recent crimes in the metropolis had nothing to do with the action of the government in parting with an officer so distinguished and so zealous in the discharge of his office as Sir C. Warren has been. So Warren's resignation had nothing to do with the antics of Jack the Ripper and everything to do with the internal politics at the Home Office. And so our 10 common myths about Jack the Ripper are laid to rest, although many, if not all of them, will no doubt continue to be trotted out for as long as interest in the case continues. I hope that you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any Jack the Ripper myths of your own that you'd like to share, please feel free to do so in the comments section below. Now, where did I put my top hat?